and the ranking minority member. I therefore ask unanimous consent that all other members' statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted in accordance with Committee Rule 3A or 3.0 without objection so ordered. I ask unanimous consent that the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, and the gentlewoman from Colorado, Ms. Bobert, be allowed to sit and participate in today's hearing without objection so ordered. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good afternoon, everyone. First off, I want to thank the Department of Interior for showing up today to discuss their contributions to the administration's strategy to develop a national system of natural capital accounting. Regrettably, the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, the Office of Science and Technology, OSTIP, and the Department of Commerce were not willing to come before the American people and stand behind their work on the national strategy to develop statistics for environmental economic decisions, a U.S. system of natural capital accounting and environmental economic statistics, for short, the National Strategy on Natural Capital Accounting, tongue twister there, which could fundamentally change the management of our public land and water and the environment for years to come. The Department of Commerce refused to testify but committed to submitting testimony for the record. Well, as of this hearing, the committee hasn't received any testimony from Commerce. They now claim they will send the testimony next week after the hearing, but we'll have to see about that. Don't hold your breath. Overall, it is clear the Biden administration has a complete aversion to accountability. The congressional oversight is not a choice. These bureaucrats in D.C. need a shock to the system because they have forgotten who they really work for, who are the American people. Additionally, this is not the first time OMB has obstructed the committee's oversight efforts. In fact, during the 118th Congress, OMB has refused to discuss any of their work under the jurisdiction of the House Committee on Natural Resources. OMB's repeated refusal to testify sends a clear message from the Biden administration to the American people that we are above the law, above Congress, and accountable to no one. The refusal to testify also allows us to draw the inference that OMB, OSTIP, and the Commerce cannot justify, defend, or even explain this bizarre and radical scheme. The brazen defiance of congressional oversight by OMB, OSTIP, and Commerce is unacceptable. The people deserve transparency and accountability. Regardless, this committee stands ready to use every tool at its disposal to administer effective oversight of OMB, OSTIP, and Commerce, and rein this out-of-control administration in. Now turning to our testimony hearing today. As many of you know, the United States is a resource-rich nation, unlike any other. In many ways, we already account for our nation's many priceless natural assets like minerals, timber, and oil and gas production on federal lands. However, as governments around the world, international organizations, and the private sector attempt to formalize the treatment of natural resources as a form of capital, we must take great care so that a natural capital accounting system will best serve our nation rather than serve as a weapon to achieve partisan goals. I'm also concerned that the United States will defer to international authorities to guide the development and implementation of a national system for natural capital accounting, following standards set by organizations unaccountable to the American people, such as the United Nations, European Union, International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank. Unfortunately, but as expected, the Biden administration plans to use their national strategy for national capital accounting to advance harmful mandates under the guise of climate stewardship, exclusionary and legally impermissible DEI initiatives, and radical anti-use priorities rather than for the benefit of the American people. Notably, the national strategy underpins numerous related initiatives for the Biden administration to include the beautiful 30 by 30 initiative, the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, proposed conservation and landscape health rule, and the recently withdrawn New York Stock Exchange proposal to list national assets companies. The conservation and landscape health rule represents a seismic shift in public land management that will fundamentally upend BLM's multiple use mandate, which has guided land management practice for another 50 years. This rule is a threat to rural communities across the West that depend upon the responsible use and development of our public lands. That is why I support H.R. 3397, the West Act, which will withdraw the harmful proposed rule. The conservation and landscape health proposed rule also supports the development of natural asset companies, or NACS, corporations that will control the rights and management authority of certain areas, including public lands, for anti-use purposes. This is particularly concerning due to the massive impact NOx could have on management of federal lands, effective conservation of wildlife habitat, and responsible development of natural resources. As member of Congress, we must ensure that the ideas endorsed by the national strategy do not become another tool for the out-of-control Biden administration, radical eco-activists, and nonprofits, and the international organizations to control America's public lands. As we witnessed over the last 3 years, President Biden is determined to log up public lands and water across the country from a sort of resource development, causing tremendous harm not only to our economy, but to our national security as well. Russia and China are laughing at us as President Biden repeatedly jeopardizes our national security and the security of our great allies in Europe by handicapping vital domestic resource development. We must determine a better path forward for the future of our land management and environment policy for our nation. So I look forward to our conversation today, and I now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Stansberg, for her opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for those who are joining us today. You know, I'm all for oversight of our nation's public lands and conservation policies. I think it's important to review them and understand how they will impact our communities. And so for that, I am grateful for the opportunity to have this hearing. But I do have to say, as we were preparing for this hearing and trying to understand what exactly it was about, we were a bit confused about how it was positioned. In fact, it seems as though we've got 3 unrelated public lands initiatives that are all designed to increase public participation and transparency and modernize the way that we do our natural resources management as a country. But in the casting of this hearing, many features of the kind of conspiracy theories that we hear about on social media, foreign actors, socialism, globalism, China, were all a part of the conversation. And it even cast the New York Stock Exchange as some extremist, leftist, eco-activist organization, if you can believe it. So I want to just kind of clarify what these initiatives are and talk about that before we get into our Q&A. So the first is the National Strategy on Environmental Economic Decisions. This is a policy and a roadmap that's been put forth by the administration to help address really an error in how we quantify the benefits of different uses of our public lands and natural resources. And it's based on the idea that if you essentially value the full value that a natural resource provides or land provides, that you would make different decisions. So a good example is as we dammed and diverted various streams and rivers in the West, many of the fisheries that were in those streams and rivers were impacted by those development activities, causing both cultural harm to the tribal and other communities, but also significant economic impacts to the fisheries communities. And so if you were to consider the full economic, social, cultural values of those resources in your decision-making, you might have come to a different conclusion before going down a certain road. And so this helps to create a framework for bringing those economic and social valuations into consideration of federal decision makings. But it's not just some radical idea that the Biden administration came up with. It's been backed by the national academies, Nobel laureates, economists, and in fact, 80 countries around the world actually use this as a basis for decision making. And so this is really about bringing the United States into the mainstream in terms of how we do natural capital accounting and our own decision making. I also think it's worth noting that this was an initiative that was begun during the Bush administration. In fact, some of our great conservationists who served as political appointees during that administration, as well as the Trump administration, helped to try to advance the accounting of natural capital that we're now looking at as part of this policy. The second is the BLM Public Lands Rule. We've already had multiple hearings about this rule. Certainly there's some wild conspiracy theories about trying to tie up public lands under this rule, but it's really about modernizing the Federal Lands Management Act and making sure that our communities and our tribes have a seat at the table, and we consider the conservation impacts of development. But the third one, which frankly, I was kind of shocked to see as part of this hearing, is a proposal that was pulled from the New York Stock Exchange that would allow essentially a new kind of corporate entity to be traded that allows essentially for investors to invest in natural capital, so in natural assets to ensure ecosystem integrity. Now, that proposal was pulled ultimately, and we're not sure what the final fate of that will be, but it was intended as an economic tool to essentially invest in conservation and improvements. And I think many people would find it hard to believe that the New York Stock Exchange is a radical leftist organization. So what all of these proposals really are about is about making sure that as a country, as a nation, as an economy, we are being responsible in our stewardship, especially as we are on the brink of a major catastrophic change with climate change, and that all of those communities, whether they're tribes or rural communities, have a seat at the table in deciding what happens to their lands. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to the conversation, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlewoman. I just want to recognize for her some of her comments. Oversight is not debatable. This committee is about these different rules. And what we're talking about is not about visitor participation on our public lands. It's about leveraging our public lands on the international stage. Now, the Fed, when you start talking about the New York Stock Exchange, this was real. This isn't hypotheticals. They turned that down. Now, I also want to remember to tell everybody that our federal lands are held in joint tenancy by the federal government on behalf of the states. So they're already leveraged. So if we're trying to look at leveraging these parcels of land again, wrong answer. So on that, I'm going to turn now to introducing our witness, Mr. Henry Wykowski. Did I say it right? Okay. And the advisor of Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Department of Interior in Washington, D.C. I want to say thank you for coming on behalf of the BLM and the Interior. As I said, the others did not show up. Let me remind you that under committee rules, you must limit your oral statement to 5 minutes. As you know, since being here, it starts green, then it goes yellow at the last minute, and red when you want to terminate. Just press the on button for your microphone, and you are now recognized, Mr. Wykowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Gosar, Ranking Member Stansberry, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on how the Bureau of Land Management's lands and programs directly and indirectly benefit the health, wealth, and well-being of communities across the United States. On a personal note, it's an honor to appear before the subcommittee today on this side of the witness table. I spent several years in the House Natural Resources Committee staff, including time as a professional staff member working on public lands issues, and I truly respect and appreciate the work this committee does to support American communities and protect the health of our shared natural resources. As you noted, Mr. Chairman, I'm appearing today as an advisor at the Bureau of Land Management. On behalf of the American people, the BLM manages approximately 245 million surface acres and roughly 700 million subsurface acres. Much of our work is governed by the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, or FLPMA, which sets out the Bureau's multiple use and sustained yield mission. Under that dual charge, the BLM manages public lands to support a wide range of uses while protecting the health of those lands to secure the resources and benefits that they provide for future generations of Americans. Balancing these priorities, ensuring appropriate use while protecting the health of the nation's public lands guides the Bureau in all of our work. Activities related to the BLM's management of public lands have been and continue to be a driver of the nation's economy and a critical source of revenue and jobs for communities. BLM managed public lands and waters supported roughly $262 billion in economic output and 1 million jobs across the country in fiscal year 2022. Resource uses authorized by the BLM generated substantial revenues for the U.S. Treasury, as well as for state and local governments. The importance of the sustained yield component of the Bureau's dual mandate is coming increasingly into focus as the BLM grapples with changing conditions on the landscape. Much like communities across the nation, the BLM is responding to extended droughts, increasingly large and intense fires, an influx of invasive species, and extreme weather events. These changing conditions, largely driven by a changing climate, are making it more difficult to manage the public lands for the uses communities rely upon and wildlife require, from healthy forage to fire-resilient ecosystems. BLM-managed public lands are also experiencing unprecedented use and visitation as Americans flock to the world-class outdoor recreation opportunities that these lands provide. In fact, our public lands hosted more than 82 million visitors in fiscal year 2022. These changing conditions and uses pose challenges for the management of public lands and for the BLM's capacity to deliver a sustained yield for future generations of Americans. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the BLM is using every tool available to meet our multiple use and sustained yield mission, leveraging the best available science and data and investing in land health while updating our regulatory frameworks to meet the needs of 21st century land management. The BLM is investing $161 million from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act in targeted restoration projects across 11 Western states to repair degraded or damaged public lands resources. These projects, which are collaborative and partnership-driven, will restore wildlife habitat in the sagebrush steppe, recreate wetland meadows, and repair watersheds. Additionally, the BLM is engaging in several key planning and regulatory updates that aim to guide future decision-making in order to balance uses on public lands while protecting land health. This work benefits from accurate data on the conditions of public lands and the potential impacts of management actions. When finalized, these proposed rules will help provide a more consistent framework for project applications, minimize potential conflicts with sensitive resources, and ensure healthy landscapes, abundant wildlife habitat, clean water, and balanced decision-making. While the BLM was not directly involved in the development of the Biden-Harris administration's national strategy to develop statistics for environmental economic decisions, the BLM welcomes efforts that will contribute to a better understanding of the value of BLM-managed public lands and waters at the national level. Continuing to ensure the best available science and information, as well as public input, are included in Bureau decisions helps improve BLM management and helps protect the important resources and values communities expect from their public lands. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
I thank the gentleman for his testimony, and once again, thank you for coming. Appreciate to see you. I'm going to recognize myself for my next 5 minutes. Now, as you are aware, the Foundation for America's Public Lands is the official charitable partner of the BLM. My question to you is, would you please share with the committee how the Foundation for America's Public Lands implements Executive Order 14072? This is the Strengthening the National Forest, Communities, and Local Economies Executive Order.
Mr. Chair, the Foundation is a separate entity from the Bureau, acting as a nonprofit, so I couldn't speak to their activities, but I don't believe they're under any obligation to act on executive orders by the President, as they're not part of the administrative branch or the executive branch.
My understanding is they're there to support the administration and use over the parks in that aspect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I admittedly, representing the Bureau, don't engage directly with the Foundation. They do act as a partner chartered by the Congress to support some of BLM's activities, but I couldn't speak to exactly how they carry out that mission.
So I'm going to ask you another question. How does this work interface with the administration's national strategy for national capital accounting?
Again, Mr. Chairman, apologies. I am not engaged directly in the operations of the Foundation as a separate entity, so I couldn't speak to how they carry out that strategy.
I'll switch gears. If adopted by the Department of Interior, the conservation leasing system and BLM's conservation landscape and health rule would impose through regulation the targets of the Paris Agreement, the economic objectives of executive orders 13990 and 14008, and the monetarized national asset inventory policy being promoted by this White House.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, could you repeat the question?
I'm
sorry, apologies.
Yeah, would you please share with the committee why such transformational policy changes are needed and how changes in the BLM regulations would affect the current multiple use and sustained yield inventory system required of the Secretary under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you said, the proposed public lands rule is really driven by our multiple use and sustained yield mission. We believe that there's an opportunity to continue to build on the great work that BLM has done for the past 50 years to ensure we're protecting the health of public lands, to ensure a sustained yield for future generations of Americans. And although the proposed rule isn't finalized, we believe that tools within it, like the proposed conservation leases, will be an effective tool to help better support that sustained yield mission.
So you do know that these lands are held in joint tenancy for the states and with the federal government, right? You do understand that?
Mr. Chairman, I think that I would defer to the department's solicitors on the appropriate relationship between the federal government and the states on the legal status of those lands.
Also, like states like Arizona actually were coerced into, we're the last state, they joined the union, and we were coerced by Taft to actually accept those federal lands aspects. And a lot of our budgetary aspects are determined on BLM lands, by the way, on energy and mineral development, as well as grazing leases, right?
Certainly, Mr. Chairman, as I noted in my testimony, the Bureau has a significant economic contribution to both the federal treasury and state and local government revenues.
So let me ask you, how do you amortize something like participation? The ranking member used this aspect of participation around the world. How do you monetize that?
While the BLM was not involved in the development of the national strategy, as I noted, we definitely support opportunities to better understand the value of these resources and how we can use them to support the Bureau's sustained yield mission.
So do you actually develop them? Is this process going to allow others to develop these resources when we're sitting here when we can't develop these resources?
Are you referring to the conservation leasing process? Sorry, I just want to make sure I'm
I'm
understanding.
talking about this asset program.
The national strategy. Again, the Bureau was not involved in the development, but my understanding of the strategy, as I prepared for this hearing, is that it is a 15-year phased approach. So I think it would be probably a little bit premature exactly to speculate on how it might, if at all, impact land management decisions in the future.
Okay. Well, it seems very awkward to me that we're amortizing these lands when our first in line is our states, because we utilize those, as you know, in minerals in Arizona, there's oil and gas and coal in Wyoming. So these are all very important aspects of the budgetary process that tries to maintain a balance of conservation with multiple use doctrines, whether it be energy, mineral, timber, and also leasing processes. So with that, I've run out of time, so I'm going to hit the ranking member for her 5 times because she's on a plane too.
Okay. Well, I do want to just take a few moments to try to clarify a little bit about history, land tenure, leasing, and what we're talking about with natural capital and some of these rules. So first of all, I think it's important just to understand the history of the West. The lands that are now currently in my state and Arizona and the rest of the West are indigenous lands. They've been stewarded for thousands of years by our native communities, and they were then a part of Spain and Mexico, and they were invaded by the United States in the 1840s and came into the United States public land holdings in 1848 under the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was actually decades before either of our states became states. And so while the states have state lands that are administered and owned by the states and administered for the purposes of getting value out of them, the federal government holds tenure to federal lands. So there's 2 systems there, and they're managed under 2 different governance systems. And this is really about federal lands. That's what the hearing that we're having. These rules, this framework would only pertain to federal lands, not state lands. So let's make sure that we're clear on that. In terms of the use of natural capital, it's kind of a really nerdy concept. And so I think it can be difficult for folks to understand. It really comes out of environmental economics from the 1960s and 70s. And it was this idea that when you are valuing natural resources, if you have a commodity like, say, minerals or oil and gas, it's already traded on a market. So you're able to put an economic value on it. So if you're doing a cost-benefit analysis, you can say, all right, if we develop this resource, we're going to get this value out of it, and ultimately we can provide a monetary value. But I think over the last 4 or 5 decades, we've really understood that by only considering the economic value of commodities that can be sold, that you undervalue other assets on these public lands that may have also economic benefits, things like protecting forests that are part of our vital watershed, other ecosystem benefits like fisheries, for example, of our rivers and streams. And by providing creating an economic value, then when you do a cost-benefit analysis, you can put on equal footing and more transparency to say, is it worth developing this mineral or this particular natural resource at the expense of this other resource, which we didn't previously value. So it's really an economic concept. And as I understand it, Mr. Wykowski, I know you've already said here today that you weren't involved in the development of the framework, but the valuation framework that the administration's put forward and would ultimately become a part of how agencies do evaluation would be in the context of things like NEPA, public land set-asides, things like that. Is that correct?
Certainly. We would definitely follow the law, even as we work through how to implement this strategy. But
at the end of the day, it really is a way to value resources that were not previously valued, correct?
That is my understanding of the strategy, yes. It's to expand, as you mentioned, to expand the consideration of assets that are not adequately valued currently.
But it would still happen through a public process. So that valuation, whether it was done through an administrative process of public land management policy or the creation of a new monument or deciding whether or not to open a specific area for leasing, would still follow the same public process whereby those who have an interest in the land, tribes, others would participate in that process. Is that correct?
So again, I think that as the strategy is a 15-year approach, I think we are still a long way from considering directly how we'll participate in these processes. But that said, we certainly welcome opportunities to better understand the value of these resources so that we can build them into things like those NEPA processes and allow opportunities for adequate public comment and help better inform decisions. So I think that there is a great potential there for that process to work closely with many ongoing processes at the Bureau.
But and I know I'm going to run out of time here. I just want to clarify for everyone out there who's listening. This doesn't replace existing processes. This is a way of bringing another factor into cost benefit and to decision making so that we don't undervalue resources that our communities depend on and our ecosystems depend on. So I think it's just really important that people understand this is about leveling the playing field, creating transparency, and making our decision-making more robust. Thank you. Yield back.
Just a quick question, Mr. Wykowski. In this system, you have nothing. You don't have something that you can show. When I mine something, I have something to show and I can sell. Now what we're putting forward is a value on what conservation or what we're looking at clean air or whatever. You're not given anything. You feel good about that aspect, but you have nothing, right?
Well, Mr. Chairman, again, while we're not directly involved in the development, my understanding is that the accounts would cover a wide variety of values, including energy and mineral resources, fisheries, timber, as well as some of these harder to measure resources like the value of clean water and fire resilient forests.
I'd have a hard time believing that we're going to leverage our current mining, which doesn't exist very much. I mean, it takes over 20 years to get a mining permit actually to a position, and I doubt it even takes longer than that. But from that standpoint, I think we're pigeonholing this Ponzi scheme because all you're doing is you're making it feel good because you don't own anything. That's the basis of a Ponzi scheme, is that there's nothing that you keep going down the road trying to invest, but there's nothing there for you to inertly say, this is what I did, right?
I'm not familiar with the structure of Ponzi schemes, but my understanding is that the strategy is driven by the Office of Management and Budget, Science, Technology, and Policy, as well as our colleagues at the Department of Commerce, and that it's a whole of government effort to capture the value of these resources that we're currently not adequately valuing in our national economic considerations.
I see this as very problematic all the way across the board. And
some people actually value clean air, though.
Oh, and I think our clean air is actually cleaner than it was.
And addressing our climate crisis.
Well, I would actually like to debate that too, because I think current policies don't show us that we're actually embracing climate change. We're actually doing it worse off because we're actually utilizing more oil and gas that are dirtier than what we produce. So I think we could argue that back and forth.
I think you just made the point of why we need this. So that's a
No, I
great
don't
place
think
to
I
end.
don't
as
think I
you-
did. I don't think I did. The gentleman from Montana, okay. Gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and Ranking Member Stansberry for holding the hearing today. It is no secret that the administration has used our federal lands to try and implement their most egregious climate and environmental focused policies. Their actions over these past 3 years have done nothing to help Americans who rely on this land for their livelihoods, and also, despite their claims, have done nothing to keep our American landscapes clean and beautiful. Take, for instance, the Judith Gap in central Montana. Once a pristine expanse, it is now marred by towering wind turbines that disrupt local wind patterns and frequently fail to generate energy during Montana's harsh winter conditions. I've posted online just 3 weeks ago this very event. It's 30 degrees below zero, drove through the middle of the wind farm, and not a single one of the turbines was turning. It's extremely concerning how an administration whose apparent goal is environmental protection could force such a visually intrusive and unreliable energy source onto the American people. And this is just one example of the short-sighted and poorly thought-through policies concerning federal lands and enacted by this administration. Consider the Conservation and Landscape Health Rule proposed last summer, which initially seemed like another instance of the administration appeasing the climate zealots. However, subsequent developments revealed a much more concerning agenda. The Conservation Lease BLM rule, which clearly violates the Taylor Grazing Act and the BLM's mandate for multiple use, appears to pave the way for leasing parcels of land to natural asset companies. While public outcry and this committee's intervention compelled the SEC to retract its plan for natural asset companies, recent information suggests that the group behind this scheme is undeterred. The notion of commodifying public land for foreign entities and prohibiting the resources that are located on the land from being developed, allowing them to profit from taxpayer-owned resources while treating water and air as commodities, is truly dystopian. With all this in mind, and while it should be no surprise that the other 3 witnesses did not come here to defend their decisions by testifying today at this committee hearing, I have several questions for you, Mr. Murkowski. First and foremost, thank you for your willingness to come in and testify before this committee and showing the courage that unfortunately the other witnesses lacked. However, with that in mind, how do you square your agency's conservation lease rule with its blatant violation of the Taylor Grazing Act?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. The public lands rule is really driven by our multiple use and sustained yield mission, and will help us better to manage the resources across the landscape while ensuring a sustained yield for future generations of Americans. I think we might have to agree to disagree on its interaction with other laws, but I personally am not an attorney, and would refer to the department's attorneys on the relationship between the Taylor Grazing Act
So
and the
what I will
proposed
tell
rule.
you is that the Taylor Grazing Act calls for, and is in statute, that the priorities are for agricultural purposes, much of which is to sustain food sources for people across the United States. This was put into place back in the 30s, and that's when they were focused on that. And now the BLM rule is literally taking conservation measures and placing it above that food production, that agricultural use, which is completely in contrast to the statute itself. And so that's why we've had so much of a problem watching BLM propose a rule that truly is in conflict with the statute itself.
Congressman, as I noted, the proposed rule really derives from our obligations under FLPMA. It doesn't elevate conservation above other uses, but ensures that we're providing for adequate conservation use alongside other multiple uses so that we can deliver a sustained yield for future generations of Americans across our public lands.
Regarding the SEC and New York Stock Exchange recently withdrawn rule regarding the natural asset companies, do you see any issue with allowing foreign countries or entities to invest in and control U.S. federal lands and profit from prohibiting the use of the resources that are located on those lands? Do you see any problem or conflict with that?
Congressman, I'm only familiar with the SEC's proposal from what I've read about it in the popular media, but the department has been quite clear that we were not involved or engaged in the SEC process, so I would hesitate to speculate on, how that might play out if it were adopted.
So I just got down to it. Mr. Chair, I would yield back. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In October 2023, the SEC proposed a rule to approve the New York Stock Exchange's request to list natural asset companies. I led out on a letter to the SEC with 31 other members in the House expressing strong opposition to the process and the proposal itself. Thousands of stakeholders across the country wrote to the SEC in opposition to this proposal due to the surrendering of local control to elite investors, radical environmental groups, and even foreign governments. Briefly, NACs would have prohibited the, quote, unsustainable activities on public and private lands. In bureaucratic language, this is code for blocking all legitimate economic development, including energy development, food production, grazing, logging, and access to other raw materials needed for housing and industrial construction. In short, what NACs would do would be to allow someone like Bill Gates to buy the natural assets of, say, Shoshone National Forest in the state of Wyoming and block essentially all access, management, and use to that resource. But not just someone with billions of dollars such as Bill Gates, it would also allow China, Venezuela, Iran, Russia, other malign actors from purchasing the natural assets of these lands, both federal lands, BLM, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service lands, but it also would apply to private lands or any private lands who had conservation easements on them. So those farmers and ranchers who had placed conservation easements on their property could wake up one day and be in partnership with the Chinese Communist Party. Obviously, this is something that was one of the most dangerous rules I have ever seen, and I am pleased that the New York Stock Exchange saw the light and withdrew it. But Mr. Wachowski, I just have a couple of questions for you. I know you weren't involved in the SEC's proposal, but I'm highlighting these concerns because the BLM is responsible for the management and mismanagement of these resources on 10% of this country's acreage. And I can't even imagine that the BLM would think that the SEC's or the New York Stock Exchange's proposal was appropriate or that it would be a good thing to do. Do you know whether the BLM weighed in with the SEC challenging the SEC or the New York Stock Exchange's ability to sell the natural assets of BLM lands?
Congresswoman, my understanding is that the department has been clear that we had no engagement with the SEC on this proposal.
So you had no engagement with the SEC at all? The SEC never contacted the BLM and said, we're going to sell your, or the New York Stock Exchange? They didn't contact you and say, we're going to sell the natural assets to the BLM lands?
Congresswoman, I have to refer you to the SEC for how they go about their public comment processes.
No, I'm asking the BLM.
As I noted, the department has had no engagement with the SEC on this withdrawn proposal.
Interesting. Did you call them up and say, we don't like this idea?
Again, Congresswoman, we have not had any engagement with the SEC on this withdrawn proposal.
Why don't you think that the BLM should weigh in on this proposal that would have sold all the natural assets to the BLM lands to, say, China?
Again, I'm not familiar with the content of the proposal,
So
only
the
from what
BLM
I've
is
read in the
just not
popular
taking a
media.
position?
But
The BLM is just...
we and all our land management work are committed to following the law and meeting the tenets of our multiple use and sustained yield mandate.
Okay, Mr. Wachowski, do you believe that just perhaps our foreign adversaries would have a reason to cripple our access to raw materials needed for legitimate economic development? Don't you think that would be something that our foreign adversaries would want?
Congresswoman, I'm here today to represent the Bureau of Land Management, so that's outside of my area of expertise.
Well, the BLM is where we access coal and oil and gas. It's where we have grazing rights in Trona. It can't be outside of your expertise. That's what we do on our BLM lands.
And certainly we're committed to meeting all those multiple uses on the public lands through our management.
In the case of the New York Stock Exchange's proposal, they didn't include any kind of investment exclusion for foreign adversaries. In fact, the Intrinsic Exchange Group, who worked closely with the New York Stock Exchange, explicitly stated that foreign governments could invest in these NACs. They're not just okay with it, they actually extended the invitation. So I want to, and I think that that's of grave concern and something that the American people should understand, that the New York Stock Exchange, along with the SEC, were inviting foreign governments to come in and purchasing, for example, the natural assets associated with all of our BLM lands. But I also think it's important for the American people to understand that the BLM did nothing to push back on that kind of a radical idea. With that, I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arkansas. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank the witness for being here today. And I do want to make a clarification here. The idea of valuing our natural assets, I don't think is a bad idea, and I think the U.S. is probably behind in that, in creating standards. And my understanding is that some foreign entities, even China, are working on international standards that could be used against us, be used against products produced in America. And my first question is, where are we on, and I want to make the distinction between developing standards and using those standards in a nefarious way. So can you tell me where we are on the international stage as far as the U.S. leading on developing standards for valuing our natural assets?
Thank you for the question. My understanding, although the Bureau was not directly involved in the development of this proposal, is that it is an opportunity to participate in an ongoing process that I believe 80 countries globally are developing standards. And so this is an effort by the United States government to coordinate across several agencies to develop these standards in a cohesive manner to support interagency engagement. This is a 15-year phase strategy, and we're very early in the beginning stages of that strategy.
I'm concerned that we're getting behind and we're allowing people who don't have our best interests at heart to develop these standards, where the U.S. has generally been a leader in standards development around the world. Now, with that said, the committee has heard concerns from every corner of the country that the proposed conservation and landscape health rule could be used to restrict currently permitted activities on BLM lands, such as grazing, energy production, and recreation. So how would a national system for natural capital accounting potentially affect conservation leasing as outlined in the proposed conservation and landscape health rule?
Congressman, as I noted, we're relatively early in the development of this strategy. It's a 15-year phased approach, so it is potentially a little early to speculate on how it might be used. But as I noted in my testimony, we welcome opportunities to use better data to understand the value of these assets to inform our decision-making.
So in the proposed conservation and landscape health rule, why did BLM decide to allow foreign entities to apply for conservation leases?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. That was a comment we heard loud and clear during the comment period on the proposed rule, and it's one that as we move towards finalizing the rule, we're certainly mindful of and hoping to address as we move forward.
That doesn't really answer why we allowed them to do that in the first place. But in the interest of time, the poster behind me, which is taken from an April 2023 presentation from the Department of the Interior, outlines how natural capital accounting aligns and supports DOI and BLM priorities in the Biden administration, which, that being said, it's ironic with Ms. Hageman's questioning that BLM or DOI had no contact with the SEC or the New York Stock Exchange throughout this process. Can you explain how DOI and BLM will use natural capital accounting to advance your DEI and environmental justice goals?
Again, Congressman, this is a 15-year strategy, so I think it would be early to speculate how, if at all, this might impact land management decisions on the ground at the BLM.
You didn't talk about DEI and environmental justice goals. How are you going to use that?
As I noted in my testimony, the Bureau was not involved in the development of this national strategy, but we look forward to working with our colleagues across government to figure out the appropriate implementation to work within the multiple use and sustained yield mandate provided by Congress.
So this presentation and meeting behind me, you're saying basically didn't happen? You're not?
I'm here today as a representative of the Bureau of Land Management. I'd have to refer to the Department of the Interior for questions about other agency priorities.
Well, my next question is, how will DOI and BLM use natural capital accounting to advance the America the Beautiful initiative and 30 by 30 goal to lock up 30% of America's lands by 2030?
Again, Congressman, it's early in the development of this national capital accounting strategy, so I hesitate to speculate on how it might be implemented on management on the ground.
Speaking of 30 by 30, Congress has been asking this question for a long time, and I hope we can finally get an answer today for the American people. How much progress has been made towards the 30 by 30 goal so far?
Congressman, at the BLM, we're working hard to support the vision of the America the Beautiful that the president's laid out for supporting locally led conservation, for protecting the health of our natural resources, and engaging with communities across the country.
Do you make a distinction between conservation and preservation?
Yes, Congressman.
What is that distinction?
Depends on the context, but certainly there are a variety of definitions we use to help govern our land management in different situations.
I've seen preservation cloaked as conservation many times, and I've got a real problem with that. It's been over 3 years since President Biden took office. When will DOI provide a report on the metrics being used to measure progress and exactly how much land and water has been locked up in the 30 by 30 initiative?
I don't have an answer for you today on that, Congressman, but I'd be happy to take a question and back for the record and get you an answer from the department.
If you could do that, and I'm out of time, but I will submit some more questions for the record, and I appreciate you coming over today, and I yield back.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say the rookie in me came out. I should have acknowledged that you were the chairman of the full committee, and I didn't. We're going to entertain a second round of questioning if you would like. So the chair is going to recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Hageman, again for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I have so many questions for the BLM. 48% of the surface estate in the state of Wyoming is owned by the federal government, and about 65% of our mineral estate is owned by the federal government. So when those resources are mismanaged, it has an enormous impact on my state and the citizens of my state. And when you have programs such as the 30 by 30, what you now call America the Beautiful, which I would vehemently disagree with because I don't believe that that's ultimately what will happen. With those efforts, I think you'll see what we have been seeing over the last several years, which is the continuing of catastrophic forest fires for failure to properly manage our National Forest Service lands. Removing grazing from our BLM lands is going to have very serious impacts not only on the economy throughout the state of Wyoming, but it will impact the quality of those lands and the grasses as well. So I'm going to talk to you specifically about some of the things that the BLM has been doing in the state of Wyoming. In mid-August of this last year, the BLM Rock Springs Field Office introduced their draft resource management plan for revision for the Rock Springs planning area, which makes up 3.6 million acres of land in the state of Wyoming. In total, under the preferred alternative, about 2.5 million acres would be off the table for consideration for new rights-of-way, and about 1.6 million acres would have been denied any type of access for grazing, oil and gas development, trona, those sorts of things. By the way, Wyoming's the largest trona producer in the nation, the largest coal producer in the nation, and one of the largest oil and gas producers in the nation. So these issues are extremely important to us. That would have been an increase of more than 480% in acreage off limits to important things like power lines, pipelines, and maintaining roads. And this proposal would also heavily restrict trona mining as well as oil and natural gas development, which are key contributors to our economy. We learned from a former BLM employee that this proposed alternative took a very short time to develop. It was Alternative B. And he said all of their efforts and the $8 million that they spent on this effort was actually focused on developing Alternative D as in dog compared to Alternative B as in boy. In his words, he said, in coming up with alternatives B and C, B basically denying access, management, and use to the vast majority of these lands, we sat down and in 1 week, they developed them together. And so over the years, they spent years developing alternative D and about a week on B and C. Yet, because of this administration, alternative B was the one that was chosen by the BLM. And having been someone who's dealt with NEPA for decades now, NEPA requires you to take a hard look at the alternatives and the decision that is going to be made. Would you agree with me that spending years on alternative D as compared to 1 week on alternative B demonstrates that the BLM never did take a hard look at alternative B before deciding that that was the plan that they were going to go forward with?
Congresswoman, I'm not aware of these assertions by a former BLM employee, but certainly agree that NEPA requires us to take that hard look, and we will do that across all land management planning efforts, including the Rock Springs RMP.
Okay, well, would you agree spending years on something would be considered a hard look, and where spending a week on something probably wouldn't qualify?
Again, Congresswoman, I'm not aware of the assertions by this former employee, so I would hesitate to speculate, but I am certain that on the Rock Springs RMP, we did take that hard look that NEPA requires in compliance with the law.
Okay, and really, in large part, you're avoiding my question because you recognize that spending a week on alternative B isn't most likely going to pass court muster, especially when the $8 million in the years were spent on studying alternative D. So I just want to make sure that the BLM truly understands the implications of what happens when decisions are coming out of Washington, D.C., rather than the local offices, and rather than in conjunction with the state and the stakeholders that actually know how to manage the resources in Wyoming. It's extremely damaging when you have an environmental agenda coming out of D.C. that don't really understand, the folks who don't understand how to manage those resources, what it can do to not only a state like Wyoming, but actually the country as a whole. The war on coal, the war on oil and gas, the war on affordable energy is affecting everyone in this country. It's why I've introduced the Energy Poverty Prevention and Accountability Act, because I want to make sure that agencies like the BLM are actually having to quantify the costs associated with the decisions that they make. I think the American people deserve that. And I will again say, I think that the BLM needs to come to the table with the state of Wyoming and come up with a legitimate resource management plan for not only the Rock Springs district, but the remainder of Wyoming that BLM controls. So with that, I yield back.
All right, the chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Wilkowski, I know you've answered a lot of what I'm going to ask you because I've heard it throughout your testimony, but I just want to go through it again just so that I get it on my record as what we're doing. And I've spent some time reviewing the national strategy to develop statistics for environmental, economic decisions, and natural capital accounting. Since you referenced it throughout your testimony, you are familiar with this document, the National Strategy for Natural Capital Accounting, correct?
Although the Bureau was not directly involved in its development and preparation for this hearing, I familiarized myself, certainly.
You say yes?
Yes,
okay.
certainly.
Okay. Now, according to the strategy itself and information from the White House, the lead authors of the National Strategy for Natural Capital Accounting are the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the Department of Commerce. Is that your understanding as well?
That is my understanding, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. So, as the sole representative over there for the Biden administration, can you explain to me why the OMB, OST, and Commerce all refused to come here today to discuss their work and explain to the American people just what the heck the natural accounting, capital accounting, and ecosystem service valuation is all about?
Congressman, I can say that the Department of the Interior does its best to accommodate witness requests from the committee at every opportunity, and I'm pleased to be here today to talk about the work we're doing at the BLM.
Let me just ask you point blank then, why are OMB, OSTP, and Commerce refusing to testify in front of Congress on this important issue?
Again, Congressman, I can only speak for the Department of the Interior that I know the department does its best to accommodate witness requests from the committee, and I'm pleased to be here today to speak about the work at BLM.
Do you think it's fair that OMB, OSTP, Commerce, and frankly the White House just left you here all alone, stranded on that island over there, just to answer questions about a national strategy document that were authored by other agencies. You think that's fair?
Congressman, again, I really can only speak to the department. I know that at the Department of the Interior, we do our best to accommodate witness requests from the committee at every opportunity.
So you think it's fair? OMB and OSTP authored a strategy and issued directives on how the Department of Interior and the Bureau of Land Management should implement the strategy, but then left you here to answer all the questions about their strategy and the directives. Do you think that's fair?
Congressman, again, I really can only speak to the Department of the Interior's considerations for witnesses.
Listen,
but,
man, I tell you what, I'll answer it for you. No, it's not fair. It's absolutely a shame that the Biden administration left you here all by yourself to answer the questions about a major national strategy that was written by 3 other agencies who refused to testify in front of Congress here today. And I'll tell you what, we may have different views on policies and politics, but I kind of feel bad for you sitting over there with the OMB and the OSTP and the White House tossing you out here to the wolves alone while they don't show up. And I don't blame you. If you decide to leave the Biden administration, call me. We'll help you get a job somewhere. But let me just finish by saying this. It's absolutely outrageous that the Office of Management and Budget, the Office of Science and Technology and Policy, the Department of Commerce, and the White House sent you here today by yourself to answer for stuff that they've done. But it's not surprising. I mean, it speaks volumes, and it's complete lack of accountability from this administration. And as we know from the elderly man with poor memory in the White House all the way down, that the Biden administration doesn't like getting questions. But we're going to keep asking questions. We're going to keep getting answers, whether President Biden likes it or not. And with that, I yield back, and seeing no other members asking questions.
Mr. Chairman, I'll just make one final comment, which is that we're grateful that the Bureau of Land Management and Department of Interior came and joined us here today. I think it was an educational hearing for my colleagues who are newly being introduced to the concept of natural capital. I especially appreciate Mr. Westerman's comments about how the United States is behind other nations and needs to standardize the way in which we do economic accounting of our natural resources, and grateful that we have a forester in the majority who serves on this committee who understands the value that our natural resources have as we're making decisions. So I think that's important. And I do thank you, Mr. Wajkowski, for coming to testify today. I think the policies that this administration is continuing, which were begun decades ago by other administrations, including conservative and Republican administrations, are vital to the modernization of our public lands and our natural resources and our competitiveness internationally. So appreciate your work on that. And with that, I think we're done. Thanks.
All right, I thank the witness for his testimony and members for their questions. The members of the committee may have some additional questions and for the witness, and we ask you respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the subcommittee clerk by 5 p.m. on February the 22nd. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there is no further business, without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.